Dr. Ben Thirkell-White, you lecture in political science at Victoria University, and tonight at our Do Something series you've spoken to us about the impact of the global credit crunch on developing nations. In a nutshell, what is that impact?
Yeah, through a number of different channels it makes their life more difficult. It reduces prices for things that poor countries have been accustomed to selling. It means that people who've gone overseas from poor countries to earn more money are more likely to lose their jobs, less likely to be sending money back home. There's less private money flowing to developing countries because bankers are nervous and bringing their money back home. And finally, there's pressure on both international aid money and on the money that NGOs can send to developing countries. And all of that comes... It's a kind of double whammy for developing countries because they're losing earnings and they're also losing the money that governments take in to spend on things like social safety nets. And so there'll be increases in poverty and a decreased ability for governments to do anything about it.
And what's been the response of G20 type countries, IMF, World Bank and so on, to the situation that developing countries find themselves in?
There hasn't been total silence. These issues were talked about at the G20 meetings in April and probably will be again at the ones coming up next week. But the overwhelming focus of attention has been on fixing the big problem, and that means attention on back home. So developed countries have spent an enormous amount of money bailing out banks, the kind of money that would make a staggering difference in the developing world. There hasn't been any increase in aid to developing countries of any significant magnitude. Countries have simply pledged to keep their aid spending at the same levels they were before. But the problems have got much worse, and countries have bigger demands on them, but no more aid to deal with those demands. So that's kind of the central problem.
You spoke early in your lecture on the issues for developing countries being basically created by Western economies' excess and the overconsumption of the overdeveloped West. But if overconsumption has produced the problems, will more consumption, which you seem to be arguing for a kind of Keynesian solution of stimulus, only you would like to see more stimulus in developing countries, is encouraging consumption going to be a long-term or even medium-term solution, or are we going to see this happening again?
Yeah, I mean, at some level, those of us in the West have a lot of money to buy stuff from the developing world. And so part of what I said about export earnings going down is that when we stop buying stuff, people in Zambia, for instance, earn less money on things like copper. And that's part of what's driving the problem for the developing world. So at some level, us continuing to buy stuff does good stuff for development. But there's lots more going on about distribution, and it really matters what we buy and what we consume. And it matters also whether developing countries are getting a good deal for what they try to sell us. Not so much an issue for New Zealand, but Europe and the US charge taxes on goods produced by poor people in developing countries when the goods arrive, so that we don't buy as much stuff from them as we should. That could change. There are all sorts of things we could do to give developing countries a better deal so that what we consume comes from people who need more money and perhaps slightly less from us. And that may mean that we have a slightly lower standard of living, but we can afford that, I would have thought, most of us.
So you're not arguing for if it's good for General Motors, it's good for Tanzania type of solution?
It's a mixture of both, in the sense that there are advantages in us being rich for the developing world because it means we have money to spend on stuff. And that's money in the pockets, eventually, of people who grow coffee and cocoa. You know, cafe culture is good for coffee growers. But it's not as simple as that. And there are lots of, ifs and buts about exactly what the links are between the money we have.
Because trickle-down development theory doesn't seem to have worked. The growing disparity between North and South hasn't been solved by unprecedented growth in the North over the last couple of decades.
No, and in the South as well. It's the idea that growth will automatically solve poverty problems is wrong. Having said that, it's very hard to remove poverty without growth. What matters is how the growth happens, which kinds of people get jobs, which kind of people don't. So, for example, a lot of the investment in Latin America in the 90s was in very capital-intensive stuff like mining. did some good for rich people who managed to get a mining concession, didn't do very much for poor people because it wasn't employing anyone. By contrast, although factory conditions in Southeast Asia aren't ideal, at least places like Indonesia and Malaysia were getting investment in businesses that employed quite a lot of people, and that increased living standards and it pulled people out of poverty. So consumption's good, but on its own it's absolutely not enough, and there are plenty of issues about equity, about charging more taxes so that governments can spend on infrastructure in the developing world and that kind of thing.
There's also, it was raised tonight, there's issues about sustainability. We didn't talk, for instance, about peak oil, and yet your models seem to be based on the assumption that we're dealing with an economy that's just trucking along, only with some modifications, but it's pretty much the structure and type of economy that we've presently got. We can make it more just, but what about green issues and issues of overconsumption of oil and the ability of technology to actually deliver a solution on that?
I mean, my first worry is always talking about issues of consumption and green issues in the same breath as talking about development. I'd be very worried if we decided that we shouldn't have any more growth and consumption in the developing world for environmental reasons, because there are 2.8 billion people living on less than $2 a day. Those people need to consume more. Whether endless growth in the West is sustainable, it's clearly not in the medium to long term. And again, I guess that emphasises this sort of mixture between you need growth to kind of keep things going, but at the same time you need a lot more attention paid to redistribution than there has been, and to moves that try to increase consumption and growth in a sort of self-sustaining way in the developing world.
Well, we've talked about North and South and West, but with China owning more and more of the American economy and increasing its influence in the IMF and in the growth and development of developing nations in Africa and Latin America and the Pacific, is it simply a matter of, I mean, China would still call itself a developing country, so if we transferred growth away from the west to the east, are you saying that would be a good thing, or should we transfer it from the west to the south, or somewhere in the middle, or whatever?
Yeah, it kind of doesn't exactly. Well, the linkages are complex. China's a very mixed country, and if you go to Shanghai, it doesn't feel very much like a developing country. But if you go to Xinjiang in the west, it's very poor. In terms of, and that's a big issue for China that China probably needs to struggle with a little bit more than it has been. But in terms of China projecting its influence outwards, and whether that's sort of support for developing countries, whether it's a kind of extra piece in the powerhouse of developing country interests on the world stage, views are mixed. China has a much more laissez-faire attitude to where it puts its money than the West does. And there are good and bad things about that. It means that Chinese money is not attached to some of the sort of pushing around that countries have had from the IMF and World Bank that's been unproductive. On the other hand, there are also worries that some of the good influence that you get from donor communities, and I think it is good influence on stuff like human rights and democracy, you're not going to get from Chinese aid. And Chinese aid is an alternative source of finance for countries that don't want pressure on those kinds of issues, and that could be a problem.
And also destabilising for the global order of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I worry a little bit. I suppose as a British person, we don't have much place in the global order. One worries a little when the big power in the United States talks about the rising power as something destabilising global order, because it smacks a little of self-interest.
Lastly, these are all very macro kind of issues. Just quickly, what can we do? You've said there's no silver bullet, no big single solution. What sort of things can ordinary people, the sort of people that turned up to your lecture tonight, what can they do?
Yeah, I think the hope that one could magically change everything overnight is probably optimistic. Doesn't mean that there isn't scope for thinking about that and being educated about some of the big structural issues, campaigns about trade, campaigns about third world country debt. But there are also practical things you can do. Write to your MP and challenge them to actually spend 0.7% of GDP on the aid budget.
Make them listen.
Yeah.
Thank you.